Oh, hello. I think I started 3 seconds too early. Hi, I'm Polly Mackenzie and welcome to Demos and the Red Cross for this event looking at the future of humanitarian policy, both in the UK and abroad. We are absolutely thrilled to be partnering with the Red Cross in celebration, the British Red Cross celebration of their 150th anniversary. So what we're going to do today is I'm joined by Mike from the Red Cross, who's going to say a few words and tell us about that history and also the collection of essays that we are publishing today, involving contributions from our three other fantastic guests, Alison Phipps, Nimco Ali, and Patricia Hewitt. And I'll then ask them to speak, say a few introductory words, have a bit of a discussion, and then open up for questions from you who are with us today. So there's a Q&A at the bottom. Please do post your questions there and I'll be able to bring them in. If you see a question that's the same as the one you were going to ask or that you really like, feel free to upvote it as well. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Mike. Mike.
Thanks so much, Polly, and morning, everyone. As we launched this collection of essays, we're in our second year of responding to the coronavirus, both here in the UK and internationally, and it seemed like a really good time to take stock and think about what we've learned, but also look forward to the future. And this has been one of the most significant operations in our 150-year history. And while there is so much support that's still needed to be provided, it's vital that we start to apply the lessons that we've learned. As the Red Cross, we've got many years of experience of responding to disasters, from large-scale major emergencies to personal crises. It's our core purpose. It's the reason we were founded on the battlefield 150 years ago. But the sheer scale and longevity of the COVID-19 response has been challenging for us all. The pandemic has revealed every stress and strain in the system and laid bare the structural inequalities and flaws. And we have indeed been in the same storm, but in different boats. The essays in this collection bring together a diverse range of views and perspectives from people in the UK and around the world, and from a range of disciplines and across the political spectrum. The essays from the speakers here today, Nimco Ali, Patricia Hewitt, Alison Phipps, but also from others, including Ian Duncan-Smith, Ceylon Andy Hickman, Tobias Elwood, and Nisreen Elsaim, capture the themes of a challenging year and propose approaches to some of the enduring humanitarian issues on which we work. As I read the essays again, I was just struck by the common themes that connect them. The ability to take a human approach, even when operating with urgency and scale, the criticality of the influence of people with lived experience, the resilience that comes from connectedness, the recognition that we are small actors in relation to the scale of need, so collaboration is critical. And finally, the importance of working together towards a vision for a different kind of system that makes that human approach more likely. And the effects of the coronavirus have rippled through society, arguably ripped through society, exacerbating existing inequalities and exposing new ones. And we need to reflect collectively from a place of compassion and kindness, but I think combined with rigorous analysis on the truths that have been exposed by the pandemic, and use what we now know to inform future strategies for supporting people in crises. The murders of George Floyd and Sarah Everard also took place during this pandemic, and were in different ways seismic moments, reworking the lens through which we look at the pathway forwards. And as we begin to recover, at least here in the UK, we have a unique opportunity to learn and build towards a different vision of a more human, more resilient and fairer future, ensuring that people are not left behind either in the UK or around the world. The voices of people recovering from crises must shape the approach we take so they can determine their own future, and others must play an active enabling role, from politicians and policymakers to those supporting communities and working in civil society. But as well as exposing the major challenges we face, this year has also shone a light on our many strengths, especially, in fact, the capacity of civil society. And as we have all seen, everyone has a part to play during an emergency, and that's what we see around the world in all our work, where the communities respond first. And we need to harness that community spirit that we've seen thriving during the COVID-19 response. And voluntary agencies have played a huge role both here in the UK and around the world. Around the world, we have been supporting our partner Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies to mobilise volunteers, providing PPE, hygiene education, vaccine support, and more. And here in the UK, we've worked closely with local charities to offer support through community-based responses, working with people on the ground and those with local knowledge and expertise. We've mobilised cash support, a national helpline, assistance with hospital discharge, support to refugees and asylum seekers, and community education work. More than 1,000 of our volunteers signed up to assist Fair Share in supporting food distribution, an activity that we've hardly been involved with really since the Second World War, almost doubling Fair Share's existing number of volunteers. And our volunteers continue to support at NHS vaccination centres, working alongside St John Ambulance and local charities. And we've also mobilised a whole range of spokespeople across social media and other channels to help overcome vaccine hesitancy so that people can stay safe. And together, we're stronger if we work together. We have 150 years of experience in emergencies, but we're also aware of our own limitations. We may be perceived to be large, but our footprint is small in relation to the scale of need. And we know that we can achieve so much more when we work collaboratively. The experience of 2020 has galvanised our partnership working and sharing of ideas with others who have also been responding to the crisis, but we still need to do more. We've learned so much from our involvement in the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergencies Partnership, which we co-chair, and which brings together 30 to 40 national organisations and 200 local ones within the sector, with the aim to improve coordination at national and local levels before, during and after emergencies, in order to ensure that the right support gets to the right people at the right time. And now we must keep collaborating and make this way of operating our new normal. And this is not easy to do always. It requires patience, persistence, and a presumption of goodwill from all partners. But working more collaboratively in the future, we can have an even greater impact where people live. We can generate and share insight from a range of sources to help identify those most vulnerable to risk and work harder to ensure that those delivering community-based support are as diverse as those communities themselves. And we also need to recognise the importance of connections within communities. We know that people who are more connected socially are better able to cope with and recover from crises. Contingency plans must be put in place for people who live alone, have limited support networks, or at risk of abuse at home. Our commitment to putting people at the heart of solutions is always important, but it's particularly crucial when addressing sometimes controversial or uncomfortable challenges, such as vaccine equity, climate change adaptation, asylum issues, or sexual and gender-based violence. No single organisation can solve the kind of enduring issues that have been exposed and exacerbated by COVID-19. As the British Red Cross, we will continue to try to scale up, to fill the gaps, to support people to recover, and to prevent them falling into future crisis. But where we can't fully meet people's humanitarian need ourselves or with our partners, we will advocate for change. And as we look to the future, we need to learn to trust different communities of thought to shape the changes that we want to see. Today, in this discussion, we have the opportunity to explore those challenges that we face, and crucially, the opportunities for change. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Back to you, Polly.
Thank you so much, Mike. I've noticed that a couple of dozen people have joined since I said welcome. So welcome again. Just as a quick reminder, you're here with Demos and the Red Cross talking about the future of humanitarian policy, both in the UK and in terms of international. That was Mike Adamson, who is the Chief Executive of the Red Cross here in the UK. If you have questions, please do post them in the Q&A section. I'm now going to move on to our wonderful panelists. I'm going to start with Alison Phipps. So Alison holds the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow, where she's also Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies and co-convener of Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, which means it's truly extraordinary that she has time to be with us today. And Alison is one of the contributors to the essay collection, arguing around refugee integration needs to start from the moment somebody arrives in the UK and not simply after their asylum application has been approved. Alison, tell us about that and also your wider thoughts.
Balche, welcome everybody. I'm speaking to you from the Highlands of Scotland and there's snow on the hills, but it's an absolute delight to be here with these panelists and to be sharing some of the perspectives from what we've learned from our work in Scotland. Glasgow, as many of you will know, has been the UK's #1 city for the dispersal of asylum seekers. So we've over 20 years experience of welcome, but also of integration as a mutual responsibility. And I've been working with members of the Voices Network from the Red Cross for many years now, and with colleagues across a range of different organisations and in individual communities, watching the ways in which those who have arrived and for whom the Scottish Government has a duty of care, those seeking asylum and refuge in the UK, how they have been part of showing us what welcome means. So in the essay that I have offered to this volume, that sits alongside some lovely neighbours in the volume, and I'm thinking here particularly of my friend and colleague, Dr. Sabia Zazai, who is Chief Executive of the Refugee Council in Scotland. I've taken that phrase that Mike used, where he speaks about people working on the ground, and I've taken it really seriously, starting with my 2-year-old granddaughter in her pink flowery butterfly Wellington boots, jumping up and down in the middle of January in a park in the East End of Glasgow with me, saying, "Look at me, Abai, look at me, Abai, look at me, I'm jumping in muddy puddles, I'm Peppa Pig." Now, my granddaughter, her mother is Bilan, she's from Eritrea. She came to the UK as an unaccompanied minor and on the new immigration plan from the UK government would not be allowed to stay in the UK, like others, like Dr. Sabia Zazai. And so what I'm seeing in my volume is, yes, the importance of welcome, but also this work on the ground, jumping up and down metaphorically in muddy puddles together, sometimes to make a mess, sometimes to make a noise, sometimes to protest, sometimes just for the sheer exuberant joy, not of doing welcome, but of doing the day-to-day work of enabling us all to integrate into the society that we are creating together today. Because every day we begin again, and it's a task on all of us. Fostership is what we speak about in Scotland. Beyond integration, what happens after welcome, the way that the bonds of milk, to quote my colleague Alistair McIntosh, are stronger than the bonds of blood, particularly when people have been disrupted, displaced, have had to flee, when their family life back home has become unsustainable, and new ways of being fostered into society need to occur. So I just want to leave you with that image which was helped and enabled by the British Red Cross through over 150 years of it fostering kindness on the ground and enabling me to jump up and down in a puddle with my very Scottish, very Eritrean 2-year-old granddaughter who calls me Abai and who calls me Grandma, and to say that that doubling, that multiplicity is so much greater than a single narrative, a single story, or a single language. Thank you.
Alison, thank you. Really inspirational. I did think maybe you were going to say that she self-identifies as a pig and that that's a new boundary of identity, but perhaps politics, that's the next wave of political integration. Thank you for leaving us with that really compelling image. So the next to speak is Nimco Ali, who, as many of you will know, is an FGM survivor, but also a campaigner and an author of a brilliant book about saying what you're not supposed to say. But today, Nimco, you can say whatever you like. I'm not going to tell you not to. She was born in Somaliland. She grew up in the UK. She co-founded the 5 Foundation, which is the global partnership to end FGM. And that is what she has focused on in the collection. for the Red Cross, focusing on how the global movement to end FGM once and for all needs to rely on empowering African women, not just telling them what to do.
Thank you very much, Polly and Alison. That was a beautiful opening that you gave. I won't be as eloquent. So yeah, I am actually the daughter of a refugee and a child refugee myself. I'd lived in this country prior to going to Somaliland and the civil war happening there. So we ended up losing everything, and the documentations that we had, the passports that we had in order to be able to travel were invalid. So therefore, I had to claim asylum, come to the UK. The Red Cross has a special place in my heart because it was how we found my grandfather while we were in Somaliland. What is Somaliland now today? My grandfather was taken by the dictator. He was put on trial and was due to be executed. And we had thought that he had actually died. But what had happened was that on the Wednesday of the Thursday before they were meant to be executed, the rebels broke my grandfather and several other leading men in the revolution out, and my grandfather found his way to Ethiopia, to a refugee camp. He ended up being assaulted there, and then ended up in a Red Cross field hospital where his documents were taken, and then it was found the fact that he had family in the UK in rainy Manchester that were looking for him. I remember vividly. I remember the civil war in Somaliland as a 6-year-old, then turning 7 there in Djibouti. I remember my grandfather as a 6'4" tall, incredible man who, when I ended up seeing him a year and a half to 2 years later at Heathrow Airport, being incredibly old because the turmoil of war and being in a refugee camp was something that was very much vivid. But then I also understand completely how my mother has a mental suitcase that she hasn't unpacked, and she's always going to return to Somaliland. She's always going to return to the country of her birth. And that is something that I have very much seen through all refugees, is the fact that they will go back one day. Another Somali sister of mine, Warsan Shiri, said that nobody puts their children in the water unless the land is on fire. So in terms of the broader conversation around the refugee crisis and what's going on, I think the principal form of that for me, as somebody that's an African and somebody that is passionate about the continent of Africa, is how we have let that continent down. I sit around every day and talk about the need that where democracy and capitalism go hand in hand, but we have spent the last 30, if not 40 years of the existence of the continent of Africa actually overlooking that, not allowing young people and entrepreneurs and people to be able to develop, and for us to really not hold dictators and people that are ruling the continent of Africa accountable. So as much as I could sit here as a refugee and understand, the privileges that I have, having been given asylum in this country, I also ultimately understand that actually peace and being able to go back to somewhere where people consider their home is something that is ultimately valid. And I think the thing that I would care more about, I would demand or expect the G7 countries to do more, is not necessarily about their asylum system, but ultimately about the roles that they play in really bringing peace to the continent of Africa and beyond. And basically that's where I sit at this moment, and I'm happy to take questions, so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Nimco. Really helpful. And thank you for telling us about your grandfather. He sounds fantastic. So our final panelist is the Right Honourable Patricia Hewitt, who is currently independent chair of Norfolk and Waveney Health and Care Partnership. And Patricia, we were talking about the experience of the pandemic in Norfolk and kind of questions around equality and equity there. But of course, Patricia was also previously Secretary of State for Trade and Industry and Cabinet Minister for Women, and Secretary of State for Health, who pioneered smoke-free legislation. So also thank you for that. My dry cleaning bills have a lot to thank you for.
Polly, thank you so much for that introduction. And it's just, I feel very privileged really to be with you and to have had the opportunity to hear both Nimco and Alison. Thank you for those really moving and inspirational contributions. I thought that was wonderful, and a pleasure, Mike, to be with you and have the opportunity to say happy 150th birthday to the Red Cross, the British Red Cross. It's great. Just by way of introduction, let me add, I'm Australian by birth, 4th generation Australian, even though I don't sound like it. I came over here as a student, and so, gosh, that was over 50 years ago. And I was conscious almost from the moment I arrived of how differently I was treated as a member of what I think in those days used to be called the old Commonwealth, which was a not very veiled way of saying the white Commonwealth. So Australia, South Africa, Canada, New Zealand. And the government at the time, in order that it could discriminate between Commonwealth citizens, all of whom in theory had the right to come to Britain, had invented something called the grandpatrial clause. And I had one grandfather, it was sexist as well as racist, born in the UK, which meant I could come here and settle here without any problems, which is what I did. But of course, if you came from a new Commonwealth country, in other words, if you were South Asian or African or Black from some other part of the Commonwealth, then the chances were you didn't have a grandfather born in Britain, which was the qualifier. And it was a very crude form of racism. And one of the very first campaigns I got involved in was a campaign on behalf of British women who were not allowed to bring their foreign husband into the country, a law that was entirely introduced in order to stop British women who came from India, Pakistan, some other part of the new Commonwealth from being joined here by their husband or fiancé. So I just wanted to indicate that because I've been very conscious really all my adult life of both of being an outsider in the sense of not having been born and brought up in this country, but also having just that degree of privilege that comes with coming as a white person and being treated in a completely different way. But what I just want to say a few words about the subject of my essay really is the huge and actually very exciting opportunities that we have in Britain, and I'll particularly talk about England at the moment, in the changes that are happening within the NHS and more broadly in our health and care system. Because I think one of the huge shocks, one of the wake-up calls from the last 14 months, the experience of COVID in this country has been the revelation to many people of the depth of inequalities in our own country. And Mike, you talked very movingly about the global inequalities, but here, we have seen COVID absolutely not affecting everybody to the same degree and in the same way. We've seen 9 out of 10 doctors who died of COVID were Black or Asian origin British doctors. We've seen, if I look around Norfolk and Waveney, we know that the worst outbreaks and the highest incidence of COVID have been in our poorest communities. We know a lot of those outbreaks have come, for instance, in food processing plants, low-paid jobs, staffed by generally our lowest income workers Many, not all of them, but many of them, migrants from particularly other parts of the European Union or other parts of the world. At one point, we had a number of outbreaks, some in food processing plants, some in childcare settings. And of course, it turned out the largely male workers in the meat processing plants were very often, their partners were working also in low-paid work as carers, and the COVID was transmitting across. So those social, economic, and racial inequalities that we've seen with COVID, of course, they're not new. They were a deep problem in our country before COVID, but COVID shone a light on them and made them worse, absolutely exacerbated them. But in a way, fortunately, for several years before COVID arrived, all around the country, we had been building integrated care systems, bringing together all the different fragmented bits of the NHS and social care and other parts of local government. And those integrated care systems are now going to be put on a statutory footing from next April. We're expecting the bill to give effect to this at some point next month. And what this gives us, and NHS England, the government, equally committed to this, is a real opportunity to focus on people's health and well-being and the inequalities between them, the quite shocking gap, for instance, in life expectancy between somebody living in a leafy suburb or a comfortable middle-class village like my own and those living in our poorest communities. And if I look at the health and well-being strategy that we've all signed up to in Norfolk and Waveney, and the same would be true across the country, regardless of the political party that's in control in the local government, you will find in pretty much every strategy a commitment to tackling and reducing health inequalities, generally as the number one priority. But of course, the NHS cannot do that on its own. You know, the NHS doesn't have a pill for unemployment or the stress that comes from being in an insecure, low-paid, dangerous job. The NHS can't cure loneliness. And loneliness, as the Red Cross often reminds us, is in itself a huge killer. And it is quite shocking that in our country, there are over 1 million people, older people, who have nobody to talk to and will literally go for a week or more without talking to anybody. That lack of human connection that Alison was talking about. So the big opportunity in an integrated care system is not just for the different parts of the NHS to work together or for the NHS to work more closely with local government. It's an opportunity for all of us in the statutory sector to be working with our communities and with the voluntary and community organizations and the social enterprises that our country is so rich in. And that, I think, more than anything else, gives me huge hope for the possibility that as we come out of this pandemic and into whatever the new normal turns out to be, part of making that new normal better than the old normal will be the human connections within and across our communities and between our communities and our statutory services that will actually enable people to have healthier, happier lives. Look forward very much to questions and the discussion.
It's a great goal, healthier, happier lives. Mike, do you want to respond to what we've heard from the panel? And I'll then draw in some questions. If anybody has questions that you've been brewing, please do type them in. Mike.
Yes. Well, thank you. And thank you for your inspiring stories. And, you know, what's really struck me in the course of our work in the COVID response is that link between the human stories and the impossible dilemmas that people were faced with, be it the impossible dilemma of choosing to leave, you know, your home to get on a boat, beautifully described, or the choices that people felt, had here in the UK around, because of the combination of health and economic crisis, because this was a health crisis, but it had with economic consequences. I always remember a lady that we helped who had faced an impossible choice of who lived in North Wales, of whether she had enough money to either drive for her cancer appointment in Chester or to do her weekly shop. I mean, that's an impossible choice. And, you know, happily we were able to help, but all over the country, all over the world, people are being faced with impossible choices. And given that I meet people, you know, here in the UK and around the world, leaders of huge, you know, with huge commitment to making a difference. And yet somehow the whole is less than sum of the parts in the ways in which we work. And what is it about our leadership styles that needs to change in order to help the whole system to work better, so that we connect up the human stories that each of you have told with a system that works better? And I agree with Patricia. We're very hopeful, optimistic about the leaning in that will come with integrated care systems. But all of us need to do that. And it's a different style of leadership. I think it has consequences for our boards, because a board needs to assess an organization's performance, not just on what it's done itself, but what it's achieved with others, and where actually it's sometimes hard to attribute where the success lies. And that's true in both our national work and our global work, of how we enable these collaborations to take place more easily, and the kind of leadership that needs to be in place to enable that to happen, to link up, you know, the human stories with system change that makes it more likely we have great outcomes for people.
So the first question from our attendees is about integration. So I can't give you the name, it's an anonymous one, but is integration properly understood by most Britons, or do too many white Britons think that integration means just learning to behave exactly like a Brit, rather than finding a way for us to be different and yet together? I'm paraphrasing. I wonder what the panelists' reflections are on that. Patricia, we've already heard your experience coming from Australia, and Nimco, I wonder what your thoughts and feelings about that pressure for, you know, integration, and, you know, that really striking image of your mum with a mental suitcase pack.
Yeah, I think that we have to separate the difference between integration and assimilation. So with the freedom of movement, and what had happened is that a lot of Somalis who had fled to other European countries all came to join each other in the UK, because within Europe there is a demand for you to assimilate. And as a first generation Somali, I think there's also, just as much as there is a need for people to want to be able and for you to act like everybody else, there's also this unease within the family and within the community for you to be too westernized. Because like I said, my mother and her family and my grandfather ultimately went back after 3-4 years in the UK, are intended to go back, so they don't want you to integrate too much. So that, like, you know, this country does absorb culture, it does absorb difference, and it does actually find a space for that. So I have been very lucky to be very British and very African in the same stance. I like, you know, I feel as comfortable in the Lake District as I do in Hargeisa, and it's very rare to find that, because of the fact that I went to a school that didn't see my Somaliness, it saw my Britishness. It, like, you know, educated me to a certain extent, and then I was able to be Somali at home, and then I had this kind of balance. I think we've kind of lost that, in the sense to kind of not offend and bend backwards. We've actually just got, when I was growing up, there were no schools where every single person in that community, in that classroom was Black. I've been to places in London, in Wembley and so on, where there is literally no white kids because everybody has just kind of moved out, and that community becomes the new migration kind of thing. So I think integration is great. Assimilation, especially for forced assimilation, not so good, because that is what happens in other countries across Europe, and that's why a lot of immigrants feel uncomfortable, because they are forced to assimilate but not necessarily accepted as much as we are in this country. If that kind of answers the question.
I think it's a really helpful distinction. Do others have reflections on that, Alison?
Yeah, I just wanted to say this is an area in terms of policy. So thinking about what Mike was saying about both the need for the human stories, like the ones that we've shared from our own families, but also the systemic change. It's where Scotland diverges from much of the rest of the UK. So I chair the New Scots Refugee Integration strategy for a partnership from the Scottish Refugee Council, the Local Authorities Network, COSLA, the Scottish Government, and then from my own work as an academic. And there we see, we call it New Scots because this is the language that everybody wanted to bring forward to get away from stigmatizing people based on a short-term journey they may have had to make, as opposed to who they are in the full multiplicity of their personalities, their skills, their wide being and their human kindness. And the New Scots sees integration as a long-term two-way process involving positive change in individuals and host communities, which will then lead to cohesive and diverse communities. And it's built on academic research, which has shown time and again in the area of conflict transformation and peacemaking that the multiple is better than the mono. That when you only see someone according to one label, victim, refugee, Black, white, then it's much easier to create such a narrow set of ways of approaching that multiple contradictory human being that you won't be able to connect in a multiple set of ways. And so that's really what the New Scots integration strategy has been doing in Scotland, is saying, who are you? Who are you now here in Scotland? What might you have brought with you that we might want to show in our museums and understand? What might you want to be part of curating? What languages do you speak? Because I'm a language teacher and I only speak 3 languages, but you actually have come to us and you've got 6 languages, and actually we need all of them in order right now to make sure that everyone understands the importance and power of the vaccination programme and understands it in their mother language. So within Scotland, and we did a survey that the Refugee Council led in Scotland last year, 68% of people have said that they believe that integration as an understanding of this multiplicity of positive change in all of us and for all of us is the right approach, and it is a devolved responsibility. So it doesn't start when you gain your status in Scotland, it starts from day one. The day you arrive in Scotland as an asylum seeker, you are fully integrated into everything we can possibly be part of integrating into together, which means that my integration and questions of how I integrate is as important as anyone else. So, do I know how to make a really good cup of Eritrean coffee? Am I somebody who actually understands what it means when my colleagues say today is a day for my white scarf? These are things which are just all adding to my life. And for me, that model of integration, which is human, but also in the early stages of becoming systematic, is part of what will move us from those horrible stories that Patricia was telling about the way in which she was allowed to integrate as a member of the old Commonwealth as opposed to the new Commonwealth. So really seeing New Scots as driving a new approach to justice, to cultural justice within society, I think for me is where our models of integration are beginning to move us. But it's a struggle, and there are a lot of forces trying to turn it into an impossible to reach assimilation.
Trisha, and then I think Mike wanted to come
Yes,
on this.
can I, this is fascinating, and I just want to add something from the experience I had over many, many years as a member of Parliament in Leicester. And Leicester was the place more than anywhere else where East African Asians, so South Asian origin, but East African citizens came when they were expelled from Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania way back in the 70s and then the 80s. And, you know, this is now a large, very, very successful, well-established community in all kinds of ways. But my links with Leicester go right back to the 70s, partly through my husband. So I've seen this over a long period. And the response for quite some decades, particularly from the council and from other leaders in the city, was to some extent similar to what Alison's been describing, very much welcoming new arrivals and supporting and recognizing new cultures. But the form this took was often funding a community center for each of the new communities or faith groups. So multiplying lots of different small communities, celebrating culture and faith, recognizing lots of different religious holidays and so on. And all of that, in many ways, along with some very strong and I think very successful multi-faith work, you know, was very positive. But what started to happen, and I saw this with my own constituency, which included not just these newer communities, but some very economically disadvantaged white working class communities in outer city estates with, frankly, shocking school provision, low levels of literacy, massive unemployment because the textile industry, which Leicester made its fortune on, had largely disappeared. And so my white working class constituents started saying, hang on a minute, what about our culture? Why is nobody recognizing or celebrating our culture? I think the term cultural justice wasn't used in those days, Alison, but they didn't think this was fair in any sense at all. And of course they were right. And what it was doing completely unintentionally was feeding a racism that, you know, in part was simply a, who are these people taking our jobs, taking our money, you know, coming to our city, and all the stuff we're I'm afraid, shockingly familiar with. And so the approach really needed to be changed. And one of the things I did, just as a small contribution to that, was to start a Leicester and Leicestershire Women's Day celebration to bring together women of all the different communities. We had women who were volunteers for the Red Cross and many other voluntary organizations who were, you know, a bit like me, if you like, nice older white women from the county. And we had white working class women from my council estates, the council estates I represented. We had women from all the different Asian and East African communities. And it became a meeting point and, you know, an important and helpful one. But it was that kind of sense of exclusion from some of our white communities that I think helped pave the way for a legitimate critique of multiculturalism, you know, which had really meant welcoming new cultures, but kind of being embarrassed about the old ones.
Nimco, I think you had your hand up.
I just wanted to come back to something that Alison said, and I think this kind of concept of understanding that when you become a refugee, you don't come here because you want to, it's because you have to. So this idea of the fact that we have to force the indigenous or the pre-existing community in order to basically adapt to the newcomers, because the reality is many of those who have come with their children are happy to, like, integrate, but this assimilation or the need for you to kind of, like, I don't know, I think we just expect a lot more from the indigenous, basically the community that's there beforehand. And this idea of the fact that in this whole kind of overt way of, like, trying to get the kids to be more British, trying to kind of engage in this kind of thing, is if you have a community that doesn't, like, what didn't intend to be here and therefore is not planning to stay, I think sometimes what we do is then we put the nose, like we put the community that's already there, feeling like, as Patricia said, as though they're not being invested in. And one of the things that I found in this country is the fact that race is not necessarily the real issue, class is. And most immigrant communities or most refugee communities who leave from a level of privilege and then come into a working class community, and then the aspiration is there. So I think sometimes there needs to be more expectations from those who come to live in the community. And I say that for myself as a Somali person who integrated quite well, because of the fact that there was expectations from my mother for me to do more, then it is the other way around, because the communities we come into are mostly deprived, and then to expect them to basically do all the work, I think that's where the tensions comes from, and is what Patricia was saying essentially.
I mean, I think we've concluded that this is fascinating and complex, and we could perhaps hold an entire event about it. I'm going to ask Mike, who's got his hand raised, and then we'll move on to another question.
Well, these are the huge issues. So the challenge for host, what in our international work, of course, the role of host communities is around the world. It's the same everywhere, and about integration. And it is that combination of very practical help. I mean, language training really matters. Cash support. If you can't afford to top up your mobile phone, how can you stay connected? All these basics. The ability to, I've yet to meet a refugee or asylum seeker anywhere in the world who wanted to leave home. When they get somewhere, like coming to here to the UK, they want to volunteer and work, pay taxes, make a contribution. It's really, really striking. And yet, so few people in the host community or beyond the host community have actually met a refugee or asylum seeker, and they hear the quality of the public discourse is very poor. Some of the language our politicians use is shocking, about creation of a sense of the other, a creation of a fear factor, and a complete loss of perspective about the scale of actual population movement here into the UK, compared with the role that neighbouring countries in the developing world are playing in hosting far, far more refugees and asylum seekers than we are here in the UK. So we need to do something about perspective and understanding the facts. We need to do something about the public discourse and the language we use. And we need to do something about the very practical help to help people to integrate. So they've got the language, the cash, the ability therefore to get on, and the opportunity to work would make a huge difference, as well as to volunteer, as many of them do in our services.
Fantastic, thank you. And maybe let's have another event all about the complexity of integration, assimilation, and the role of host communities. The other question that's got the most votes, I'm going to go with the audience, is from Kate Joplin, who has got a really open question. Are the panel optimistic or pessimistic about our capacity as a country to learn the lessons of this COVID-19 crisis? We heard already about the lessons, the understanding about the depth of inequality and injustice, simple things like, the need for more integrated care, all of that. Does it feel like we're in a position to learn, or are we stuck? What do the panel think? Who wants to go first? Patricia.
I'll have a go.
The only one who's not on mute, so you will.
And I have to admit, I am one of nature's optimists, but yes, I am optimistic, because what I can see, right across the NHS, right across these integrated care partnerships, is people, goodness, who not just learning lessons now, but from the very beginning of this ghastly pandemic, were changing the way they worked, working together, in these wonderful partnerships, not just across the statutory sector, but with communities, with voluntary organizations, with private businesses, people just rolling up their sleeves, getting on with stuff, doing what needed to be done, often actually at great personal cost to themselves, but a glorious degree, frankly, of innovation within the public sector, in the NHS specifically, a level of digital transformation in about 3 weeks, that we hadn't achieved in sort of 3 years or indeed 30 years. And coming back to a point Mike was making very early on about leadership, a real sense actually of people changing their leadership style and really recognizing that when people are working, under such personal strain and stress, kindness in leadership and looking after the people you work with and the people maybe you're responsible for as a manager is absolutely critical. And there's been a very live conversation in and across our integrated care systems from a few months into the pandemic about what do we want to keep? Because despite the horrors, lots of good things have happened in response to the pandemic. And so, the phrase has been, what do we want to adopt? What do we want to adapt and build on? What do we want to abandon? There's some stuff we don't want to go back to, but a less bureaucratic way of working and a much closer partnership with the voluntary sector are two of the things that we absolutely want to adopt. So I do have this sense, a bit closer to the front line and away from some of the, frankly, rather depressing media debates and stories and all of that. Yes, I think lessons are being learned and quite a lot of change has already happened and will continue to happen.
That's great to hear. Certainly the work that we did through the pandemic at Demos called Renew Normal explored the ways in which public opinion and expectation have shifted. And whilst it doesn't, I don't think we could kind of confidently claim that everything is different now. There are areas around the value of community relationships and volunteering, patterns of how we work, where there have been really marked shifts in what people think matters and also what they think is possible, which is really valuable. Mike.
I share Patricia's optimism, and to be honest, some of the characteristics of a new leadership style that you've touched on, and around curiosity and kindness and generosity with partners, and a sense, and to be honest, also you have to have a sense that the glass is half full all of the time, but almost combined with a permanent sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo. We've got to embrace our discomfort and not just retreat back into the groups and teams and whatever they were before that we felt very comfortable in, that were kind of more like putting on a warm cardigan. This has got to be about actually challenging ourselves to be different. And I think if we can sustain that feeling of discomfort that we've had through COVID, but into the creation of a renewed vision around a human approach that is also enabling system change in all these areas. The three big causes that we're working on are people in the areas of greatest health inequality, people in emergencies, and people who are displaced. We need to embrace that combination of humanity and system change, but also but a permanent sense of discomfort with the status quo to sustain us, to bring about, to sustain that change.
Alison, and then I don't know if Nimpo, you want to contribute. Great.
Thanks, Polly. Yeah, I think I too am an optimist, and there's no reason why I should be. I have a funding portfolio of around £20 million, and it's just been cut by 70%. I'm seeing people who are in touch with me at the moment saying, whilst my government was extremely excited by the way in which we had been able to be funded to do our humanitarian work with women and girls in our country when we first were successful with this, the cut that's come in the last month means that we're now at risk of being sent to prison for taking money from the British. But even in that situation, which has been produced by the egregious cuts to the aid budget, I am still really hopeful at the way I see people come together in times of crisis to affirm kindness, to continue to be kind, to think about what can be done next, to think about ways of improvising, and most of all, to think about ways of not putting themselves first, but caring for others. And I see that day in, day out. Every morning, my phone is like my African village. You know, it is full of people greeting me with words of peace. And it's a beautiful thing. But every day, my email is full of the next systemic change that actually means that work I've been engaged in 25 years is being cut to the bone or has been left a bleeding stump. So to follow what Mike said about discomfort, courage is made in times like these. And I've seen the courage of 20 years' work within a refugee family that is courageous, within a refugee sector that is courageous, and across society where people come together to see what they can do. So I end up being hopeful. And I saw people really struggling when they went into lockdown. And they weren't the people who'd been locked down in detention centres in the UK and are now living their lives here. Those people who'd lived in detention centres were reaching out to their neighbours and saying, we know this is hard. We know you're frightened. We've lived like this ourselves. You know, at least we've got YouTube and Netflix this time round. So I see the way that even though it's a fragile thing, that, you know, those beautiful words of Emily Dickinson, in the worst of times, and we saw this in the death camps of the Holocaust, in the worst of times, hope is still a thing with feathers. And it will allow you to fly. And it's where we need the culture and the arts and ways of imagining different worlds. Why we need to be able to see, you know, the way that poetry, to quote R.S. Thomas, is that which enters the intellect by way of the heart, and the way we can find our way out of failure. And that doesn't mean sugarcoating it. That doesn't mean saying just be kind and everything will be okay. It means saying be kind and work for structural change. Give money to humanitarian assistance and give money and time and energy to structural change. It's not either or, it's both and. And from that, you get courage. And from that, you get hope. And from that, you get people like Patricia and Mike who are still sitting here saying they're optimistic and still being leaders within our own societies.
Nimco, are you going to make it a full house on optimism?
Well, I've spent the last 14 months locked down in London, so we haven't necessarily been as community focused as a lot of people might think. I am optimistic, but I'm really optimistic that the silver lining to COVID is to, one, teach us that when one of us sneezes, we all get ill, and to understand how more interconnected we are as a global community, and really be able to understand that we have spent the last, I understand that Alison is extremely upset about the aid cuts, but at the same time, for me, it's actually showing the realities of the fact that it's been 2 years. We haven't had UNGA, we haven't had CSW, we haven't had all these kind of bloated international events, and nothing has changed. The reality is African women are able to stand on their own 2 feet, and we need to be able to have that structural change, which is using from 0.5 to 0.7. I don't really care what the point is, but that money directly given to people who are able to build their communities and stay in their community. Because I love the rhetoric of trying to welcome refugees into this country and all that kind of conversations, but they don't want to leave, and they're only leaving because we are actually being problematic in the way that we structure the aid budget. So I sit here as the child of a refugee, as a mother that didn't want to leave, to actually think about the next generation of my family being incredibly British, and what anxiety that creates for my mother and her families in terms of that separation between them. How Somali are they and they're not? And that could actually all be changed by us really working towards peace on the continent of Africa.
We've got 1 minute left. So given that the point of this collection was to think about the future, I just want to come back to you all super briefly with this one question, which is thinking about the next 10 years. What's the biggest humanitarian issue on which the UK could make a difference? Anyone got an answer? Nimco.
Capitalism and democracy in Africa. So if we can do that, that would be amazing, and get rid of the aid industry.
Alison? Your DFID secretary, if DFID was still there, for 1 minute. What's top of the agenda?
1 minute. Everything Nimco says.
Great, an outbreak of consensus and agreement. What more could we want to be optimistic? Patricia?
I'd only add global poverty and climate change. It'll create more humanitarian disasters.
Mike? You're probably not allowed to decide.
Let's live up to the ambition. Probably not, but let's live up to the ambition of Britain as a force for good, and really work through what that means in how we adapt to climate change, as Patricia said, and how we take a humane approach to the movement of people that will continue around the world, across the world, as a result of both climate change and conflict and poverty. And let's embrace that from a human perspective.
It's a really inspirational way to end. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to the attendees. I'm sorry that it was too interesting and we did not get to enough of your questions, but I really hope that you will download the collection of essays. It's on the Red Cross website, it's on our website, you'll find it on Twitter as well, and read all of these words, and that you'll stay in touch both with Demos and with the Red Cross. Mike, also just thank you also for all of the work that the Red Cross has done through this pandemic. I think whilst you're not the only people who have mobilized to keep us going, it's really clear from everything you've said how important your work has been. So with that, thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.